Sir, this is a private military funeral. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. The words cut across the sacred ground of Arlington National Cemetery like a blade, sharp and dismissive, carrying the particular authority of a young officer who had never learned that rank means nothing among the dead. First Lieutenant Bradley Harrington III stood with his shoulders squared and his jaw set, his dress uniform immaculate against the gray November sky, every brass button polished to a mirror shine. His academy ring caught what little light filtered through the clouds, and he wore it turned inward the way his grandfather had taught him, a small vanity dressed up as tradition. The old man he addressed did not move. He stood between two white headstones at the edge of Section 60, where the recent war dead slept in perfect, rose-beneath manicured grass still soft from yesterday's rain. His field jacket had faded from army green to something closer to moss, and it hung loose on a frame that had once been powerful but had surrendered to years of hard living. His boots were held together with electrical tape, wrapped carefully around the toes, and his khakis bore stains that spoke of nights spent in places that offered no laundry service. Gray stubble covered his dark skin, and his close-cropped hair had gone white at the temples, but his eyes held something that did not match the rest of him. They were steady. They were assessing. They moved across the cemetery with the unconscious sweep of a man who had spent decades identifying threats before they materialized. "I knew the boy," he said. His voice was quiet, roughened by disuse, but there was weight beneath it. Each word cost him something. Harrington's lips pressed into a thin line. "A lot of people claim to know the deceased at military funerals, sir. We get grief tourists, vagrants looking for handouts, and the occasional individual with mental health challenges who believes they have connections that do not exist." He paused, letting his gaze travel from the old man's taped boots to his weathered face. "I'm going to need you to step away from the ceremony." Behind them, the funeral preparations continued. 6 soldiers in dress blues positioned themselves near the flag-draped casket that had been carried by horse-drawn caisson to its final resting place. Folding chairs stood in neat rows beneath a green tent, slowly filling with mourners whose breath fogged in the bitter air. A woman in expensive black dabbed at dry eyes with a handkerchief, performing grief with the practiced ease of someone who had arrived for the paperwork rather than the loss. Young rangers in their tan berets stood apart from the civilians, their faces carved from stone, their eyes fixed on the casket that held what remained of their brother. The old man's gaze never left that flag-draped box. "Specialist Terrence Vance," he said. "Terry, 24 years old, joined the 75th Ranger Regiment because he wanted to be part of something bigger than himself. Earned his scroll at 22. Killed in Syria 3 weeks ago during an extraction that saved 11 lives." Harrington's expression flickered, but he recovered quickly. That information was in the obituary. Anyone could have read it. "He was afraid of heights," the old man continued, as if Harrington had not spoken. "Took him 2 years to admit it to me. Said it started when he was 7 and his mother's boyfriend dangled him off a fire escape for crying too loud. He jumped out of airplanes anyway because he decided fear was not allowed to make his choices for him." "That was not in the obituary, Lieutenant." For a moment, something shifted in Harrington's posture. But the weight of his assumptions was heavier than the weight of the old man's words, and he straightened again. "Sir, I do not know where you got that information, but I need you to leave before I call cemetery security. This family deserves to grieve in peace." The old man finally turned to look at him. There was no anger in his eyes, only a weariness that seemed to stretch back decades. "His family," he said softly, "did not show up until there was a flag to fold and benefits to collect. I showed up every day for 3 years. But you would not know anything about that. You see the jacket and the boots, and you have already decided what I am. Now, if you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we would love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below and tell us your city or country. Because stories like this one, about courage and sacrifice and the heroes hidden in plain sight, they happen in every community. You might have a quiet legend in your own neighborhood whose humble appearance hides an extraordinary story of service. Consider subscribing so you do not miss what happens next. Because what happened next at Arlington that November morning would change everything Lieutenant Harrington thought he knew about rank, respect, and the true meaning of service. A cemetery security officer had begun walking toward them, summoned by Harrington's earlier radio call. The mourners under the tent were turning to watch the confrontation, whispers spreading like ripples across still water. One of the young rangers was staring at the old man with a strange expression, as if trying to match a face to a story he had heard 100 times. The wind picked up, carrying the distant crack of rifle volleys from another funeral somewhere in the vast expanse of Arlington's rolling hills. The old man flinched, just slightly, a movement so small that only someone trained to notice such things would have caught it. His hand moved unconsciously toward his chest, toward something hidden beneath the faded layers of his clothing. Harrington noticed none of it. He was already gesturing to security, already composing the report he would file about the vagrant who had disrupted a military funeral, already certain that he was protecting the dignity of the service from someone who had no right to stand on this sacred ground. But what Lieutenant Harrington did not know was that in exactly 47 minutes, a motorcade carrying a 4-star general would arrive at this funeral, and that general would walk past every officer, every dignitary, every family member gathered under that green tent. He would walk directly to the old man in the faded field jacket, and he would render a salute that would bring Arlington National Cemetery to a complete and absolute silence. Because some men do not wear their service on their sleeves. Some men carry it in their bones, in their scars, in the memories that wake them at 3 in the morning and never let them forget. And Command Sergeant Major Ezekiel Okonkwo, call sign Sentinel, had carried more weight than anyone present could possibly imagine. The security officer arrived, hand resting on his radio. Harrington nodded toward the old man. "Please escort this individual from the premises," he said. "He has no business here." Zeke did not resist. He simply looked once more at the casket, at the flag that covered the boy he had pulled from the streets and watched transform into a warrior, and he whispered words that no one else could hear. "I am here, son, just like I promised." Then he allowed himself to be led away, his shoulders bowed but his spine still straight, disappearing between the endless rows of white headstones like a ghost returning to the ranks of the honored dead. But he would be back, and when the truth emerged, when the legend standing among them was finally revealed, every person at that funeral would understand that they had witnessed something they would carry for the rest of their lives. The ceremony had not even begun, and already everything was about to change. 3 years before that November morning at Arlington, before the flag-draped casket and the confrontation among the headstones, Ezekiel Okonkwo found the boy who would save his life by letting him save someone else. January had come to Washington with a cruelty that seemed personal. The temperature had dropped below 20 degrees for the 6th straight night, and the wind that swept off the Potomac carried ice crystals that cut exposed skin like glass. Zeke had been living under the Whitehurst Freeway overpass for almost 8 years by then, long enough to know which concrete pillars blocked the worst of the wind, long enough to have watched 3 men freeze to death in their sleep because they chose the wrong spot or drank too much or simply gave up fighting against the cold. He had chosen his spot with the precision of a man who had spent decades calculating angles of fire and fields of observation. The alcove behind the eastern pillar offered cover from wind and rain, sight lines in 3 directions, and an escape route through the drainage culvert if trouble arrived. Old habits, the kind that kept you alive whether you wanted to stay that way or not. That night, Zeke had just finished his rounds at the soup kitchen on M Street, the only meal he would eat for the next 2 days, when he spotted the shape huddled against the western pillar. It was the wrong pillar. The wind would funnel directly into that position once the temperature dropped another 5 degrees, and whoever had chosen it would wake up hypothermic if they woke up at all. He almost kept walking. 8 years on the streets had taught him that you could not save everyone, that some people were determined to destroy themselves no matter what you did, that the weight of trying to carry others would only drag you down faster. He had learned those lessons in places far from Washington, in desert cities and mountain villages where the bodies piled up no matter how hard you fought, and he had no intention of learning them again. But something made him stop. Maybe it was the size of the shape, too small to be a full-grown man. Maybe it was the way it was curled in on itself, knees drawn to chest, arms wrapped tight, the defensive posture of someone who had learned early that the world was not safe. Maybe it was just that Zeke was tired of walking past things he could change. He crossed the frozen ground and crouched beside the shape. Up close, he could see he was a boy, 16, maybe 17, with skin a few shades lighter than Zeke's own and features that still held the softness of youth beneath the grime and exhaustion. He was wearing a hoodie that might have been gray once, and jeans torn at both knees, and his sneakers had holes that exposed bare skin to the January air. No coat, no gloves, no hat. He will be dead by morning. The boy's eyes snapped open before Zeke could speak, and there was no fear in them. Only anger. Only the feral defiance of a creature that had been cornered too many times to expect anything but another attack. "Get away from me," the boy said. His voice cracked on the words, betraying the cold that had already sunk into his bones. Zeke did not move. "You picked the wrong spot," he said. His own voice was rougher than it used to be, scraped raw by years of silence. "Wind shifts in about an hour. You will freeze before sunrise." The boy's jaw tightened. "I did not ask for your opinion, old man." "No, you did not." Zeke studied him for a moment, reading the signs the way he had once read enemy positions and hostile terrain. The hollowed cheeks that spoke of weeks without regular food. The bruise yellowing along his jawline that said someone had hit him recently. The way his hands stayed fisted inside his sleeves, ready to fight even as his body shut down from exposure. This boy was not new to the streets, but he was new enough that he had not yet learned how to survive them. Zeke reached into his jacket and pulled out half a sandwich wrapped in napkins. He had been saving it for tomorrow, rationing the way he always did, but tomorrow suddenly seemed less important than the next few hours. He sat on the ground between them and straightened. "Eastern pillar," he said. "Behind it, there is an alcove. Blocks the wind." He turned and began walking toward his own spot without waiting for a response. He did not expect the boy to follow. He did not expect anything. Expectation was a luxury he had abandoned years ago, along with hope and purpose and all the other things that had bled out of him in a valley in Helmand Province where his best friend had died with coordinates on his lips and absolution in his eyes. But 20 minutes later, when the wind shifted exactly as Zeke had predicted, he heard footsteps on the frozen ground. He did not turn around. He simply moved over on his flattened cardboard mat, making room, and listened as the boy settled into the space beside him. They did not speak for the rest of the night. They did not speak the next night either, or the night after that. The boy appeared at the alcove each evening as the sun went down, accepted whatever food Zeke had managed to find, and disappeared each morning before full light. It was a week before Zeke learned his name. 2 weeks before Terry told him about the mother who had left him with a boyfriend who thought discipline meant bruises. A month before he admitted that he had been in and out of foster homes since he was 11 and on the streets since he turned 16 and aged out of a system that had never wanted him in the first place. Zeke listened to all of it without judgment. He had heard worse. He had done worse. And somewhere in the listening, something that had been dead inside him for almost a decade began to stir. He started teaching Terry, without meaning to, how to find food that had not gone bad in restaurant dumpsters, how to spot the shelters that were safe and the ones where you would wake up with your shoes stolen, how to carry yourself so that predators looked for easier targets. Small lessons at first, practical knowledge that meant the difference between surviving and not. But Terry was hungry for more than survival. He asked questions constantly, probing at the edges of Zeke's silence, trying to understand the man who had saved his life with half a sandwich and a piece of tactical advice. "You were military," he said one night, not a question, but a statement of fact. "The way you move, the way you watch everything. My foster dad was Army. He moved the same way." Zeke said nothing for a long time. Then he nodded once, and the conversation ended. But something had shifted between them. Terry had seen through the homeless man to the soldier beneath, and that recognition created a bond that neither of them fully understood. "I want to be like you were," Terry said 6 months later, sitting across from Zeke at a McDonald's where they had pooled their change for coffee and warmth. "I want to matter." I want to be part of something. Zeke looked at him, at the fire burning in eyes that had once held only anger. And he saw himself at 17, before the wars, before the losses, before the weight of all those bodies had crushed him into something unrecognizable. He saw potential. He saw purpose. He saw a chance to get something right after years of getting everything wrong. The Army will not take you without a GED, he said quietly. His first real words of guidance. The first step on a road that would lead them both to places neither could imagine. Terry leaned forward, desperate and determined. Then teach me. And God help him, Zeke did. The security officer led Zeke only as far as the paved pathway that wound between sections, then stopped and looked at him with eyes that held something other than suspicion. The man was in his 60s, with a Veterans of Foreign Wars pin on his jacket and the careful posture of someone whose back had never fully recovered from carrying a rucksack through jungle terrain. You serve, the security officer said. It was not a question. Zeke met his gaze but did not answer. The officer glanced back towards Section 60, where Lieutenant Harrington had already turned his attention to the arriving mourners, satisfied that the problem had been handled. I am supposed to walk you to the gate, the officer continued. But I've been working Arlington for 19 years, and I have learned to tell the difference between the ones who do not belong and the ones who belong more than anyone. He paused. I'm going to check on something at the administration building. It is going to take me about an hour. You understand what I am saying? Zeke nodded slowly. Thank you. The officer walked away without another word, and Zeke moved to a position behind a maintenance shed where he could still see the gravesite, but would not be immediately visible to Harrington or the other officials. The ceremony was beginning, and nothing was going to keep him from watching them lay Terry in the ground. Under the green tent, the folding chairs had filled with a strange assortment of mourners. The Rangers stood in a cluster at the back, refusing to sit, their faces masks of controlled grief that Zeke recognized from 100 memorial services in 100 desolate places. A few distant relatives occupied the middle rows, people who had probably not seen Terry since he was a child, who had come out of obligation or curiosity or the vague sense that attending a military funeral might make them feel patriotic. And in the front row, positioned directly before the casket, as if she had earned the right to be there, sat Constance Vance. Zeke watched her dab at her eyes with a handkerchief that remained perfectly dry. She wore a black dress that cost more than Terry had earned in 3 months as a specialist, and her hair had been styled that morning at a salon that probably charged more for a single appointment than Zeke spent on food in a year. She kept turning to accept condolences from people she did not know, nodding graciously, playing the role of grieving mother with practiced precision. He remembered what Terry had told him about her, how she had left when he was 14, walked out the door one morning and never came back, choosing a new boyfriend in a new city over the son who had needed her. How Terry had waited by the window for 3 days before the foster system came to collect him. How he had spent years believing it was his fault, that he had done something wrong, that he was fundamentally unlovable. Zeke's hands curled into fists at his sides. He forced them to relax. Anger was a luxury he could not afford. Not here, not now. Chaplain Major Victoria Santos stepped to the podium beside the casket, her voice carrying across the cold air as she began the service. She spoke of sacrifice and duty, of a young man who had given everything for his country and his brothers. Her words were beautiful and true, but Zeke could tell she was reciting from a template, filling in the blanks of Terry's life with generic phrases that could apply to any fallen soldier. She had not known him. None of them had known him, except the Rangers at the back of the tent, who were struggling to maintain their composure, and the old man hiding behind a maintenance shed, who knew every scar on Terry's soul because he carried matching ones on his own. One of the Rangers, a sergeant with sand-colored hair and eyes red from sleepless nights, leaned over to whisper something to the man beside him. Zeke could not hear the words, but he saw both men turn to scan the cemetery, looking for something, looking for someone. They were looking for Pop. Terry had told them about him. Of course he had. The boy had never been good at keeping secrets, had never understood why Zeke insisted on staying in the shadows, why he refused to come to graduations and ceremonies and all the moments that mattered. Terry had wanted to show him off, had wanted the world to know that the homeless man under the overpass had given him more than anyone else ever had. And Zeke had refused every time because he did not deserve recognition, did not deserve gratitude, did not deserve anything except the cold concrete and the weight of his memories. The chaplain finished her opening remarks and invited Constance to speak. Terry's mother rose with theatrical grace, smoothing her dress, and walked to the podium with the measured steps of someone who had practiced in front of a mirror. She gripped the edges of the wood and looked out at the assembled mourners with eyes that glistened but did not weep. "My son," she began, and Zeke felt something twist in his chest. Terrence was a beautiful boy, full of promise, full of potential. I always knew he would do something important with his life. I always believed in him. The lies flowed like honey, sweet and thick and poisonous. She spoke of a childhood that had never existed, of support she had never provided, of a relationship that had ended the moment she walked out that door 14 years ago. She painted herself as the devoted mother who had sacrificed everything for her child, who had encouraged his military dreams, who had prayed for his safety every night. Zeke's jaw tightened until his teeth ached. Behind Constance, the Rangers exchanged glances that spoke volumes. They knew. Terry had told them the truth about his mother, had told them everything, and now they were watching her perform a fiction over his casket, and there was nothing they could do about it. She was still speaking when Harrington noticed movement at the edge of Section 60. The lieutenant's head snapped toward the maintenance shed, and his eyes narrowed as he spotted the faded field jacket partially visible behind structure. His face flushed with anger, and he began moving toward Zeke's position with the determined stride of a man who had been disobeyed. But before he could reach the shed, a murmur rippled through the mourners. Heads turned toward the cemetery road, where a motorcade of black SUVs had appeared, American flags fluttering from their antennas, moving with the slow deliberation of vehicles carrying someone important. Harrington stopped. His hand moved unconsciously to straighten his already perfect uniform. Constance faltered in her eulogy, losing her place as she noticed the attention shifting away from her. And Zeke, still hidden in the shadows, felt something cold settle in his stomach. He recognized the configuration of that motorcade. He recognized the security protocols, the spacing between vehicles, the subtle signs that indicated exactly who was riding in the center SUV. He had seen that same configuration 1,000 times, in 1,000 places, escorting men whose names were classified and whose missions would never appear in any history book. The motorcade pulled to a stop at the edge of Section 60, and for a long moment, nothing moved. Then the rear door of the center vehicle opened, and a figure emerged in full dress uniform, for silver stars gleaming on each shoulder, and Zeke stopped breathing entirely. General Marcus Webb, commander of Joint Special Operations Command. The man who shattered femur Zeke had splinted with a broken rifle stock before carrying him 2 miles through the streets of Mogadishu while the city burned around them. The man who owed him his life. The man who had spent 23 years trying to repay a debt that Zeke had never wanted collected. Their eyes met across the rows of white headstones, and Zeke saw recognition flash across the general's face like lightning. Saw the shock, the disbelief, and then something that looked almost like joy. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that his years of hiding were about to come to an end. The memory came unbidden, the way it always did, dragged up from the place where Zeke kept it buried beneath layers of silence and distance and the slow erosion of years spent trying to forget. Helmand Province, October 2006. The air tasted like dust and diesel, and something sweet that turned out to be burning opium from the poppy fields they had passed 3 kilometers back. Command Sergeant Major Okonkwo had led his Delta team through worse terrain and worse conditions, but something about this mission felt wrong from the moment they crossed into the valley. The intelligence was thin, the extraction window was narrow, and the asset they were pulling out had been dark for 6 days before suddenly coming back online with coordinates that put him in the heart of territory controlled by forces that would pay handsomely for American operators delivered alive. Ray Whitmore felt it too. Zeke could tell by the way his second-in-command kept checking his sectors, the way his finger rested just a little closer to his trigger than usual, the way he moved with the coiled tension of a man expecting contact at any moment. They had served together for 12 years by then. 12 years of doors kicked in and compounds cleared and bodies stacked in places whose names would never appear on any map. Ray had been there when Zeke earned his call sign in a firefight outside Kandahar, when he had held a position alone for 9 hours while waiting for extraction, silent as a ghost, deadly as a blade in the dark. Sentinel, they had called him afterward. The one who watches. The one who never sleeps. Ray had been there for all of it, and Zeke could not imagine a world where he was not there for what came next. The ambush hit them at the mouth of the valley, exactly where Zeke would have positioned it if he had been the one planning the kill. RPGs from the ridgeline. Small arms fire from 3 directions. The asset's coordinates had been bait, and they had walked straight into the trap because sometimes there were no good options, only bad ones and worse ones. Zeke's team was good, the best he had ever commanded. They found cover and returned fire with the brutal efficiency of men who had done this 100 times before. But the geometry was wrong, the angles were wrong, and bodies started dropping before Zeke could adjust their position. He saw Hendricks go down first, then Mullins, then the new kid whose name he had not yet learned because he made a point of not learning names until operators survived their first 3 missions. The new kid did not survive his first 3 minutes. Fall back to the secondary position, Zeke shouted into his radio. Covering fire on the ridgeline. Ray, you are with me. They moved as a unit through the chaos. 2 men operating as one organism, reading each other's movements without conscious thought. Ray was slightly ahead, slightly to the left, in the position he always took, the position that put him between Zeke and whatever was coming. Zeke saw the window a half-second before the RPG emerged from it. He opened his mouth to shout a warning, to push Ray aside, to do something other than watch what happened next. But combat moves at a speed that human reflexes cannot match, and by the time the word left his throat, the rocket was already in the air. Ray turned at the sound of Zeke's voice. Their eyes met for a fraction of a heartbeat, and then Ray did what Ray always did. He moved toward the threat instead of away from it, putting his body between Zeke and the blast, absorbing the shrapnel that would have torn through Zeke's chest and throat and face. The explosion threw them both backward. Zeke hit the ground hard, ears ringing, vision blurred, and when he crawled to where Ray had fallen, he found his best friend lying in a spreading pool of blood with his vest shredded and his eyes still open and his mouth moving around words that Zeke had to lean close to hear. Coordinates. Ray was giving him coordinates. The enemy position on the ridgeline, the one they had not been able to locate, the one that was chewing through what remained of the team. His dying breath spent on tactical information that would save the men who were still alive. Call it in, Ray whispered. Get them home, Sentinel. All of them. Promise me. Zeke called it in. The air support arrived 11 minutes later and turned the ridgeline into a smoking crater. By then, Ray had been dead for 10 minutes and 43 seconds, and Zeke had spent every one of those seconds holding him, pressing uselessly against wounds that no amount of pressure could close, whispering words that Ray could no longer hear. I am sorry. I am so sorry. It should have been me. It should have been me. He got the rest of them home. 4 men out of 12, carried and dragged and supported through 3 kilometers of hostile territory to the extraction point. He received a medal for it, a piece of metal and ribbon that meant nothing, that could not bring back the 8 men who had died under his command, who had trusted him to keep them alive. Ray's widow gave him the Bible at the funeral. Ray's Bible, the one he had carried on every deployment, the one with verses underlined and notes scrawled in margins, and a photograph of his daughter tucked inside the front cover. She pressed it into Zeke's hands and told him that Ray would have wanted him to have it, that Ray had always said Zeke was the best man he knew. Zeke did not feel like the best man anyone knew. He felt like a fraud, like a failure, like someone who had survived when better men had died, who had lived when living felt like a betrayal of everyone he had lost. He resigned his commission 3 months later. His wife tried to stop him, tried to tell him that what happened was not his fault, but he could not hear her over the sound of Ray's voice in his head, whispering coordinates, whispering promises, whispering the last words of a man who had given everything so that Zeke could keep breathing. The divorce came a year after that. His son stopped speaking to him 6 months later. And one winter morning, Zeke walked away from the apartment he could no longer afford and the life he could no longer bear and the memories he could no longer outrun. And he kept walking until he found himself under an overpass in Washington with nothing but a rucksack and Ray's Bible and the weight of 8 ghosts pressing down on his shoulders. He had been carrying them ever since, carrying them and waiting. For what? He did not know. For the weight to finally crush him. For the darkness to finally swallow him whole. For someone to finally see through the broken shell of what he had become and recognize that he did not deserve to be saved. And then he had found a boy freezing to death against the wrong pillar. And something had shifted. Not healed. Never healed. But shifted just enough to let a small beam of light through the cracks. Terry had given him a reason to keep breathing. And now Terry was dead. And the light was gone. And Zeke was standing in a cemetery watching a general walk toward him with recognition in his eyes and nowhere left to hide. Ray's Bible was in his pocket, pressed against his heart, where it had rested every day for 18 years. Get them home, Sentinel. All of them. I tried, brother, Zeke whispered. I am still trying. General Webb's arrival shifted the atmosphere at the gravesite the way a thunderstorm shifts the pressure in the air before the first lightning strike. Every uniformed service member straightened instinctively, shoulders squaring, chins lifting, bodies responding to the presence of a 4-star general with the automatic deference that years of training had carved into their nervous systems. Lieutenant Harrington abandoned his pursuit of Zeke and moved quickly to intercept the general, positioning himself as the ranking officer responsible for the ceremony. His hand snapped to his brow in a salute so crisp it could have cut glass. General Webb, sir, Lieutenant Harrington, Ceremonial Detail Commander. We are honored by your presence. I was not informed that you would be attending. Webb returned the salute with the economy of motion that came from 40 years of practice, but his eyes were not on Harrington. They were scanning the cemetery, moving across the headstones with an intensity that made the lieutenant falter. At ease, Lieutenant. Webb's voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had commanded operations that reshaped the geopolitical landscape of 3 continents. I am here in an unofficial capacity. Specialist Vance served under officers I trained personally. I wanted to pay my respects. It was a lie, and Zeke knew it. Webb had not come for Terry. He had come because someone had told him about the confrontation, about the homeless veteran being removed from a military funeral, and he had recognized something in the description that had brought him across the Potomac at speed. But how had he known? Who had made the call? Zeke's question was answered when he saw one of the rangers at the back of the tent lower his phone and meet his eyes across the distance. The young sergeant with sand-colored hair, the one who had been looking for Pop. He must have recognized Zeke from photographs Terry had shown him, must have made a call to someone who knew someone who could reach the one person guaranteed to set things right. Terry had always said his Ranger brothers would do anything for each other. Zeke had not realized that protection extended to the people they had never met, but had heard about in stories shared over meals and watches and long nights in places far from home. Under the tent, Constance Vance had recovered from the interruption of her eulogy. She stepped away from the podium and approached the general with the confident stride of someone who believed her grief entitled her to special consideration. General, she said, her voice pitched to Carrie. I am Terrence's mother. Thank you so much for coming. It means the world to know that my son's sacrifice is recognized at the highest levels. Webb's expression remained neutral, but something flickered behind his eyes. Mrs. Vance, my condolences for your loss. Constance reached for his hand, clasping it between both of hers in a gesture of manufactured intimacy. He was such a good boy, such a dedicated soldier. I only wish I could have seen him one more time before. She let her voice break artfully, dabbing at her eyes with the handkerchief that still showed no trace of actual tears. From his position behind the maintenance shed, Zeke watched the performance with a weariness that went bone deep. He remembered the letters Terry had written in those first months after enlisting, full of hope that his mother might reach out now, that he was becoming something she could be proud of. He remembered the slow death of that hope as weeks turned to months, turned to years without a single response. He remembered the night Terry had finally stopped checking the mail, had finally accepted that the woman who gave birth to him would never be the mother he needed. And now here she was, claiming a relationship she had abandoned, performing a love she had never shown, standing in the spotlight that Terry's death had created as if she had earned the right to be there. Harrington appeared at Constance's elbow, his earlier frustration temporarily set aside in favor of managing the general's visit. "Sir, if you would like to be seated, we can continue with the service." He gestured toward the front row, toward the empty chair beside Constance that had been reserved for family. Webb did not move toward the tent. Instead, his gaze swept the cemetery again, and this time it stopped when it reached the maintenance shed, when it found the faded field jacket and weathered face partially visible in the shadows. "Lieutenant," Webb said slowly, "who is that man?" Harrington's expression soured. "A vagrant, sir. He claimed to know the deceased, but he had no identification, no proof of connection. I had security remove him from the ceremony." He glanced toward the shed with irritation. Apparently, he did not remove himself very far. Constance's face hardened. "He is nobody, General. Some homeless person tried to intrude on our family's grief. I have never seen him before in my life." The words hit Zeke like physical blows, each one landing in the place where his heart used to be. Nobody. That was what he had become. That was what 18 years of hiding had reduced him to. A nobody that mothers had never seen, that lieutenants removed from ceremonies, that the world looked through as if he were made of glass. But General Webb was not looking through him. General Webb was looking at him with an expression that Zeke recognized from a street in Mogadishu 32 years ago, when a young captain with a shattered femur had looked up at the sergeant who had appeared out of nowhere to drag him to safety. Webb stepped away from Constance and Harrington without a word of explanation. He moved between the headstones with deliberate purpose, ignoring the confused murmurs that rose from the mourners, ignoring the lieutenant's startled protest, ignoring everything except the man in the shadows who had stopped breathing the moment their eyes met. Chaplain Santos watched the general's progress with growing curiosity. She had served 3 tours in Afghanistan as a military chaplain, had presided over more memorial services than she could count, and she had learned to read the unspoken languages of grief and guilt and recognition. Something was happening here that went beyond a 4-star general paying respects to a fallen specialist. Something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She looked at the homeless man the general was approaching, really looked at him for the first time, and she saw what Harrington had been too arrogant to notice. The way he stood with his weight evenly distributed, ready to move in any direction. The way his hands hung loose at his sides, fingers slightly curved, the muscle memory of someone who had spent years reaching for weapons. The way his eyes tracked movement, even now, cataloging threats and exits and angles of approach. She had seen that posture before. She had seen it in the operators who came to her services carrying burdens too heavy for words, who sat in the back rows and never spoke, and sometimes wept silently when they thought no one was watching. "Dear God," she whispered. "Who is he?" She was about to find out. The letters began 3 days after Terry shipped out to basic training at Fort Benning. Zeke had not expected them. He had walked Terry to the recruiting station on the morning he left, had stood on the sidewalk and watched him disappear through the doors with nothing but a backpack and a future that finally held something other than concrete and cold. He had assumed that would be the end of it, that Terry would move forward into the life he was building and leave behind the homeless man who had helped him survive long enough to build it. But the first letter arrived at the shelter on M Street, where Zeke sometimes collected mail, addressed in handwriting that was still rough around the edges, but improving. The envelope was thin and creased from its journey through the military postal system, and when Zeke opened it, he found 2 pages covered in words that made his chest ache in ways he had forgotten he could feel. "Pop," the letter began. That was what Terry had started calling him somewhere in the 2nd year of their friendship. a name that Zeke had never asked for and had never corrected because correcting it would have meant acknowledging what they had become to each other. Pop Basic is harder than I thought it would be. The drill sergeants yell a lot, and the food is terrible, and my feet have blisters on top of blisters. But I keep thinking about what you told me that first night under the overpass. You said I picked the wrong spot. You said the wind would shift, and I would freeze. You were right about that, and you have been right about everything else, so I figure you're probably right that I can do this too. I'm not going to quit. I'm going to make you proud. Zeke read the letter 4 times before he could bring himself to fold it and put it in his pocket. Then he walked to the public library on K Street and asked to borrow a pen and paper, and he wrote back. That was how it started. Letters moving back and forth across the distance between them, carrying words that neither of them could have spoken face to face. Terry wrote about the challenges of training, about the men in his unit, about the moments when he wanted to give up and the moments when he remembered why he had started. Zeke wrote back with advice stripped of context, guidance that came from decades of experience he never explained. The man next to you matters more than the mission. Take care of your brothers, and they will take care of you. Fear is not your enemy. Fear keeps you sharp. The goal is not to eliminate fear, but to act in spite of it. When everything goes wrong, and it will go wrong, focus on the next task. Just the next task. Then the one after that. That is how you survive. Terry absorbed every word like a sponge absorbing water. He quoted Zeke's letters back to his squad mates, attributed the wisdom to someone he called his father, and watched their faces when the advice proved true time after time. He never told them that his father was a homeless man living under an overpass. He never told them that the tactical insights came from someone who had learned them in places that did not officially exist. Zeke attended Terry's basic training graduation from the back row of the bleachers. He wore the cleanest clothes he could find at the donation bin, a button-down shirt with a small tear at the collar and khakis that almost fit, and he sat among the families and girlfriends and watched Terry march across the parade ground with his shoulders squared and his chin high and his eyes scanning the crowd for a face he hoped to find. Their eyes met for just a moment. Terry's face split into a grin so wide it threatened to break formation discipline, and Zeke felt something crack open inside him, something that had been sealed shut since Helmand Province. He nodded once, just slightly, and then he slipped away before the ceremony ended, before Terry could find him, before he had to explain why he could not stay. The same pattern repeated at Ranger School graduation. Zeke hitchhiked to Fort Benning and stood in the parking lot outside the ceremony, watching through a chain-link fence as Terry received his scroll. He saw the moment when Terry scanned the audience and did not find him, saw the brief flicker of disappointment before the pride took over, and he told himself it was better this way. Better to stay in the shadows. Better to remain a voice in letters rather than a presence that would have to be explained. But Terry was stubborn in ways that reminded Zeke of himself at that age. And 6 months after earning his scroll, he tracked Zeke down through the shelter system and showed up at the overpass in his dress uniform with a determination that would not be denied. "One meal," he said. "That is all I am asking. One meal at a real restaurant where we can sit across from each other and talk like normal people." They went to a diner 3 blocks from the Capitol, a place where the waitresses did not look twice at a young ranger sitting across from a man whose clothes had seen better decades. Terry ordered enough food for 3 people and insisted that Zeke eat until he could not eat anymore, and they talked for 4 hours about everything and nothing, about the army and the streets and the strange path that had brought them together. At the end of the meal, Terry slid an envelope across the table. Inside was enough cash to cover 6 months of meals and a bus pass and a prepaid phone with Terry's number already programmed in. Zeke pushed it back. "I do not need your money, son." Terry pushed it back harder. "This is not charity, Pop. This is family taking care of family. You taught me that. You do not get to teach me something and then refuse to let me practice it." They argued for 20 minutes before Zeke finally accepted the envelope. Not because he wanted the money, but because he understood that Terry needed to give it. Needed to feel like the help flowed both directions. Needed to believe that he was not just taking from the man who had saved his life, but giving something back. The last letter arrived 3 weeks before Terry deployed to Syria. It was longer than usual, more reflective, written with the careful attention of someone who understood that some letters might be the last ones sent. Pop, I know you think you failed somehow. I know you carry something heavy that you have never told me about. But I need you to know this. Whatever you think you did wrong, you made it right with me. You found me when I was freezing to death, and you gave me a future. That is not nothing. That is everything. So stop punishing yourself. Start living. That is an order from your son. Zeke had read that letter so many times the paper had grown soft at the creases. He carried it in his pocket next to Ray's Bible, two pieces of paper that held the only words that mattered. And now Terry was dead, and the letter felt like prophecy, and the order felt like a weight he did not know how to carry. Start living. He was trying. God help him, he was trying. The silence that fell over Section 60 was so complete that Zeke could hear the flags snapping on their poles 200 yards away. Every eye in the cemetery had turned toward the extraordinary sight of a four-star general standing at attention before a homeless man, his hand raised in a salute that had not wavered for nearly 30 seconds. Zeke's arm trembled as he held his own salute. The muscles remembered the position even after all these years, but they had grown weak from disuse, from cold nights and insufficient food, and the slow erosion of a body that had once been capable of carrying wounded men through miles of hostile territory. He could feel the weight of every gaze upon him, the confusion and disbelief radiating from the mourners under the tent, and part of him wanted to drop his hand and disappear between the headstones the way he had disappeared from everything else. But Ray's voice was in his head, whispering the same words he had whispered in that valley in Helmand Province. Hold the line, Sentinel. Hold it until the job is done. So he held it. General Webb lowered his salute first, as protocol demanded when a junior rank initiated the gesture. But they both knew the truth that protocol could not capture. In this moment, rank meant nothing. In this moment, there was only the debt of a life saved and a lifetime spent trying to repay it. Sentinel, Webb said again, and his voice carried across the silent cemetery. My God, we thought you were dead. Zeke lowered his own hand slowly, letting it fall to his side. His voice came out rough, scraped raw by emotion he had spent 18 years trying to bury. Not dead, sir. Just gone. Webb shook his head, and Zeke saw moisture gathering at the corners of the general's eyes. 23 years. I have had people looking for you for 23 years. After you resigned, after you disappeared, I never stopped. None of US did. The words hit Zeke like hammer blows. He had assumed that when he walked away, the world he left behind had simply closed over the space he vacated. He had assumed that the men he served with had moved on, had forgotten, had accepted his absence the way they accepted the absence of all the others who had fallen or faded or simply could not carry the weight anymore. He had never imagined that anyone was still looking. I did not want to be found, he said quietly. I know. Webb's voice was gentle now, stripped of the command authority that had defined his career. But that does not mean we stopped caring. That does not mean your brothers forgot what you did, who you were, what you sacrificed. Behind them, the funeral had ground to a complete halt. Constance Vance stood frozen beside the podium, her manufactured grief replaced by genuine confusion. Harrington's face had gone the color of old chalk, his certainty crumbling as he watched his commanding general treat the vagrant he had dismissed with a reverence that defied everything he thought he understood. The Rangers at the back of the tent had moved closer, their eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before them, and the young sergeant who had made the phone call was weeping openly without shame. Chaplain Santos stepped out from under the tent and walked toward the two men standing among the headstones. She moved slowly, carefully, the way one approaches sacred ground, and when she reached them, she stopped a respectful distance away and waited. Webb noticed her presence and turned slightly. Chaplain, I apologize for disrupting the service. Santos shook her head. General, I have been presiding over military funerals for 15 years. I have never seen anything like this. She looked at Zeke with eyes that held no judgment, only a desperate need to understand. Who is this man? Webb glanced at Zeke, asking silent permission. Zeke hesitated for a long moment, feeling the walls he had built around himself beginning to crack. Then he nodded, just once, and Webb turned back to the chaplain. "This man," Webb said, his voice rising so that everyone present could hear, "is Command Sergeant Major Ezekiel Okonkwo, United States Army, retired. Call sign Sentinel." The name rippled through the assembled mourners like a stone dropped into still water. Some of them recognized it immediately, their faces shifting from confusion to shock. Others looked blankly at their neighbors, waiting for explanation. But the Rangers, the men who had served with Terry, who had heard stories whispered in barracks and tents and forward operating bases across 3 continents, the Rangers knew exactly what that name meant. One of them, a staff sergeant with a Bronze Star pinned to his chest, took a single step forward. His voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silence of the cemetery, it carried like a shout. "Sentinel, the ghost of Mogadishu. The man who carried Captain Webb 2 miles through Black Hawk Down." Webb nodded. "The same. And that is only the beginning of what this man has done for his country." Zeke closed his eyes. He could feel the weight of his past pressing down on him, all the operations he had never spoken about, all the lives he had saved and the lives he had failed to save, all the years of service that had been classified and buried and forgotten by everyone except the men who had been there. He had spent so long hiding from who he was. And now, standing in a cemetery surrounded by the dead he had failed and the living he had tried to protect, he understood that hiding had never been an escape. It had only been a slower form of dying. Terry's letter burned in his pocket. "Start living. That is an order from your son." Zeke opened his eyes and looked at Webb, at Santos, at the Rangers who were staring at him with something that looked terrifyingly like hope. He thought about Terry, about the boy who had seen through the homeless man to the soldier beneath, who had believed in him when he could not believe in himself. And for the first time in 18 years, Command Sergeant Major Ezekiel Okonkwo began to consider the possibility that he might deserve to be found after all. The general extended his hand. "It's time to come home, Sentinel." Zeke looked at the hand, at the 4 stars on Webb's shoulders, at the faces watching from the tent. Then he looked at the flag-draped casket that held the boy who had saved his soul. He reached out and took the general's hand. "Not yet, sir," he said quietly. "First, I need to bury my son." General Webb turned to face the assembled mourners, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of command that had directed operations across 4 decades of service to his country. What he was about to say would not remain within the boundaries of this cemetery. He knew that. Phones were already recording, faces already turned toward the scene unfolding before them. By nightfall, the world would know what Arlington had witnessed on this November morning. He did not care. Some truths needed to be spoken regardless of consequence. "Lieutenant Harrington," Webb said, and his voice cut through the cold air like a blade. The young officer stiffened, his face a mask of barely controlled dread. "Step forward." Harrington moved on legs that seemed uncertain of their function, stopping 3 paces from the general with his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond Webb's shoulder. Unable, or unwilling, to meet the gaze of the man whose vagrant he had tried to remove from sacred ground, Webb let the silence stretch for a long moment before continuing. "You attempted to remove this man from a military funeral. You called him a vagrant. You assumed, based on his appearance, that he had no right to stand among the honored dead of Arlington National Cemetery. Sir, I was only trying to maintain the dignity of the service." Harrington's voice cracked on the words. "I had no way of knowing who he was." "No." Webb's voice hardened. "You had every way of knowing. You simply chose not to look." He turned slightly, gesturing toward Zeke. "This man served 26 years in the United States Army. He completed over 200 combat operations across 3 continents. He earned the Distinguished Service Cross for Silver Stars, 3 Bronze Stars with Valor, and 3 Purple Hearts for wounds sustained in defense of this nation." The words landed like artillery shells among the mourners. Constance Vance's face had gone slack, her carefully constructed performance of grief dissolving into something that looked like fear. The Rangers stood straighter, if that was possible, their eyes fixed on Zeke with an intensity that bordered on reverence. But Webb was not finished. In October 1993, then Sergeant First Class Okonkwo was part of the task force that deployed to Mogadishu, Somalia. During the engagement that became known as Black Hawk Down, he carried a wounded officer, myself, 2 miles through hostile territory while under continuous enemy fire. He killed 11 combatants during that movement while bearing my weight on his back. He saved my life and the lives of 4 other men that day through actions that were subsequently classified above top secret. Webb paused, letting the information settle. His voice grew quieter, more reverent. In 2006, Command Sergeant Major Okonkwo led a Delta Force element into Helmand Province, Afghanistan, on a mission that does not officially exist. During that operation, he lost 8 men, including his closest friend. Despite catastrophic wounds to his team, he coordinated air support that eliminated a fortified enemy position and personally carried 4 survivors to extraction over 3 kilometers of hostile terrain. For those actions, he was awarded the Medal of Honor in a classified ceremony attended only by the President and members of the National Security Council. A sound escaped from Constance Vance, something between a gasp and a moan. Her hand flew to her mouth, and for the first time since she had arrived at Arlington, her eyes showed genuine emotion. Not grief for her son, but the dawning horror of what she had said about the man who had raised him. He is nobody, she had declared. Some homeless person. I have never seen him before in my life. The words hung in the air between them, impossible to take back, impossible to unsay. Webb turned to face her directly. Mrs. Vance, you stated that this man had no connection to your son, that he was an intruder at this funeral. Constance's mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. Let me tell you about the connection, Webb continued. 3 years ago, Command Sergeant Major Okonkwo found your son sleeping under an overpass in Washington. Freezing, starving, abandoned by the woman who should have protected him. He took Terry in. He fed him. He taught him. He gave him the guidance and support that a father should provide. He helped him earn his GED, guided him through the enlistment process, and attended every graduation from the back rows where no one would notice him. He wrote letters that Terry carried on every deployment, letters filled with the wisdom of a man who had walked through fire and survived. Zeke felt his throat tighten. He had never wanted any of this to be public. He had never wanted recognition or credit or the weight of other people's gratitude. He had simply wanted to help a boy who reminded him of himself, to perhaps make right some small fraction of everything he had gotten wrong. Webb's voice softened as he delivered the final blow. Specialist Terrence Vance called him Pop. He was more of a parent to your son in 3 years than you were in 14. And you stood at that podium and told lies about a relationship you abandoned while the man who actually saved your son was being escorted away like a criminal. Constance crumpled. Her knees buckled, and she sat down hard on the nearest folding chair, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs that might have been genuine or might have been another performance. It no longer mattered which. Harrington had not moved. His face had progressed through several shades of color, from chalk white to gray to something approaching green. He looked like a man who had just watched his career and his certainties collapse simultaneously, who was only now beginning to understand the magnitude of his error. Sir, he whispered, I did not know. I swear I did not know. Webb regarded him with an expression that held no mercy. That is precisely the problem, Lieutenant. You did not know, and you did not bother to find out. You saw a uniform on yourself and rags on him, and you decided that was enough information to make a judgment. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only Harrington could hear. Every veteran you ever encounter for the rest of your career, you remember this moment. You remember what assumptions nearly cost you today, because the next homeless man you dismiss might be the one who saved your commanding general's life. Harrington's salute was trembling as he raised it. Yes, sir. I understand, sir. Webb did not return the salute. He simply turned away, leaving the lieutenant standing at attention with his arm raised and his future suddenly uncertain. The general walked back to where Zeke stood among the headstones. The faded field jacket and worn boots somehow dignified now, somehow appropriate for a man who had chosen service over recognition and sacrifice over comfort. "Sentinel," Webb said quietly, "the service is waiting. Will you take your rightful place?" Zeke looked at the tent, at the casket, at the flag that would soon be folded and presented to someone who did not deserve it. He looked at the Rangers who had served with Terry, who were watching him with tears streaming down their faces. He looked at the rows of white headstones stretching toward the horizon, all the brothers and sisters who had gone before him into whatever waited beyond. Then he straightened his spine, squared his shoulders, and walked toward the front row to bury his son. The mourners parted like water as Zeke walked toward the tent, their faces a mixture of awe and shame and something that looked almost like fear. He kept his eyes fixed on the casket, on the flag that covered the boy who had given him a reason to keep breathing, and he did not allow himself to acknowledge the whispers that followed in his wake. Constance Vance remained collapsed in her chair, her sobs growing quieter as the reality of her exposure settled over her like a shroud. No one moved to comfort her. No one offered a hand or a word of solace. She had positioned herself as the grieving mother, and now everyone present knew exactly how hollow that performance had been. The front row had 2 empty chairs. One had been reserved for family. The other had been left vacant out of protocol, a space for someone whose connection to the deceased warranted proximity, but whose identity had not been confirmed. Zeke lowered himself into the second chair, his worn boots resting on grass that had been manicured by hands that would never know whose son lay beneath it. General Webb took a position at the edge of the tent, standing rather than sitting, his presence a silent endorsement of everything that was about to unfold. Chaplain Santos returned to the podium. Her hands were trembling slightly as she adjusted her notes, and when she looked out at the congregation, her eyes carried a weight they had not held before. She had presided over hundreds of funerals. She had spoken words of comfort over caskets draped in flags, had handed folded triangles to weeping mothers and stoic fathers and children too young to understand why their parent was not coming home. But she had never presided over anything like this. She set her prepared remarks aside. The words she had written no longer seemed adequate for the moment, no longer captured the truth of who Terrence Vance had been and who had shaped him into the man worthy of a Ranger's funeral. "We gather today," she began, her voice finding its strength, "to honor Specialist Terrence Vance. A soldier, a Ranger, a son." She paused, letting her gaze rest on Zeke. "I have learned in the last few minutes that the word son can mean many things. It can mean blood. It can mean biology. It can mean the accident of birth that connects us to people who may or may not deserve that connection. But it can also mean choice. It can mean the deliberate decision to love someone, to guide them, to sacrifice for them when no law or obligation requires it." Zeke felt his chest tighten. He had not asked for this recognition. He had not wanted a spotlight or a sermon or the weight of public gratitude. He had only wanted to say goodbye. But Terry had wanted more than that. Terry had wanted the world to know who had saved him. And perhaps, Zeke thought, this was one final gift he could give to the boy who had given him everything. Specialist Vance was saved twice, Santos continued. Once by the Rangers who tried to bring him home from Syria, who fought and bled to recover their brother, even when the mission had gone wrong. And once, 3 years before he ever wore a uniform, by a man who found him freezing under an overpass and chose to show him that he was worth saving. The Rangers at the back of the tent were openly weeping now. They had heard Terry talk about Pop in quiet moments, in the spaces between missions when soldiers share the truths they cannot speak elsewhere. They had imagined an old veteran, comfortable and retired, supporting Terry from a distance. They had never imagined this. A man who had given everything for his country and received nothing in return except concrete and cold and the slow erosion of a life spent in service. Santos gestured toward the honor guard, and they moved into position around the casket. 7 rifles rose in unison, their barrels pointed toward the gray November sky. "Ready," the commander called. "Aim. Fire." The first volley shattered the silence. Zeke flinched but did not look away. The sound echoed off the headstones, rolled across the hills of Arlington, joined the distant reports of other funerals happening simultaneously across the vast expanse of the cemetery. Ready, aim, fire. The second volley. Zeke thought of Ray, of the sound of gunfire in Helmand Province, of the moment when everything had gone wrong and the best man he knew had died with coordinates on his lips. Ready, aim, fire. The third volley. Zeke thought of Terry, of the boy who had looked at him with eyes full of defiance and fear and hunger, who had become a man worthy of this honor, who had died saving others the way Zeke had taught him. The silence that followed was deeper than any silence Zeke had ever known. It pressed against his ears, filled his lungs, wrapped around his heart like a fist. Then the bugler raised his instrument, and the first notes of taps drifted across Section 60. Day is done, gone the sun, from the lakes, from the hills, from the sky. Zeke closed his eyes. He had heard taps more times than he could count, had stood at attention while it played for brothers who had fallen beside him, had learned to harden his heart against its mournful pull. But he could not harden his heart against this. Not against Terry. Not against the boy who had called him Pop and meant it. All is well. Safely rest. God is nigh. The tears came without permission, sliding down weathered cheeks that had not known moisture in years. He did not wipe them away. He let them fall. Let them water the ground where his son would rest. Let them speak the words he could not force past the stone in his throat. The honor guard moved to the casket with ceremonial precision. Gloved hands gripped the edges of the flag, lifted it, began the ancient ritual of folding that would transform it from a covering into a triangle, from a symbol into a keepsake. Each fold was exact, deliberate, performed with the reverence of men who understood that this was the last service they could render to a fallen brother. 13 folds, each one carrying meaning. Each one performed in silence. When the flag was complete, a perfect triangle of stars on a field of blue, the honor guard commander turned toward the front row. He took 3 measured steps toward Constance Vance, then stopped. His eyes moved from Constance to Zeke and back again. Protocol demanded he present the flag to the next of kin. But protocol had not anticipated this moment, had not prepared him for a mother who had abandoned her child and a father who had claimed him. General Webb stepped forward. He took the flag from the honor guard commander with a nod of understanding, then walked to where Zeke sat with tears still wet on his face. On behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation, Webb said, his voice thick with emotion, "Please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your son's honorable and faithful service." He placed the flag in Zeke's hands. Zeke looked down at the triangle of stars, at the weight of everything it represented, and he pressed it against his chest where Ray's Bible rested, where Terry's last letter burned against his heart. "Thank you, son," he whispered, "for everything." Somewhere behind him, Constance Vance made a sound of protest, but no one acknowledged it. No one turned. The flag had gone where it belonged, to the man who had earned the right to carry it. And in that moment, Command Sergeant Major Ezekiel Okonkwo finally allowed himself to grieve.